I'm William Massena. Sound is good? You can hear me? All right. Welcome to my talk. I don't know if you guys saw Paul Butchos. Anybody saw Paul Butchos' talk yesterday? You did? Two to three people? Paul Butchos did a talk on how to build a sustainable watch collection and how to have auction house help you do that. For those of you guys who didn't see it, it was fairly easy. You cannot build a sustainable watch collection. And if you need to have an auction house do it for you, you go to Philips. So I'm going to talk about something else. I'm going to talk about how to buy or sell a watch at auction. If you haven't never done it, I think it would be a nice introduction for you. If you have done it, I think I will teach you a couple of tricks that we use. And hopefully there'll be some question at the end. Thing is not you. Not working. Sorry, we're having technical difficulties here. Perfect. So we're going to talk about a history of auctions. You guys know how auction house started and why. And then we're going to talk about who are the players today in the watch business, and how to sell a watch, how to buy a watch. Then the danger of a catalog, how to read a catalog, which is, I think, the most important part of the talk today. And what to do during the auction, how to bid at the auction, and what to do after the auction, if you have bought the watch or you haven't bought the watch. And finally, some final notes, and we have questions. So what is an auction? In the context of this talk, we're not going to talk about eBay. We're going to talk only about live auctions. So it's when you have somebody on a stand on a rostrum bidding openly about watches. There's not going to be any eBay talk today. The first recorded auction was in Babylon, and it had to do with slaves, but mostly first women. Fathers would sell their daughters at auction to get married. And over the years in the auction business, there were an evolution of the model that had to do with the way people were buying and selling at auction. So how did auctioneers went from being pimps basically to being experts is a fairly important part of the auction history, and it has to do with the way nobility were selling their goods. In about 1750, there was a big revolution in Europe, starting with the French and later in the rest of Europe, and the bourgeoisie, the rich men, especially in the UK, there was this rise of the bourgeoisie and this decline of the nobility. And the nobility, when you were a lord, you couldn't sell your stuff to a friend. You had to hide it. So you go to a middleman and he will sell the furniture for you if you need to raise money. So you had those guys on one hand that were trying to sell the goods, and you had on the other hand a new bourgeoisie, a new class of citizens that were merchants that were trying to buy furniture and goods that was basically being sold by those noblemen. So you had people like Christie's and Sotheby's that were individuals. Mr. Christie and Mr. Sotheby established kind of little houses where people could trade using his name those goods. And that's basically the beginning of auction. It's kind of that trade-off of goods between the nobleman to the merchant. And that will last for a very long time, because that with the revolution, with the expansion of the UK colonialism, the merchant class really rose and the nobility went in decline. Starting after the Second World War, auction house was mostly a British business. There was no auction house outside of Great Britain. Christie's was actually the first auction house to open an office outside of London, and a lot of people think it's New York, but it's not. Christie's opened the first auction house outside of London in Geneva. And the reason, it was in 1954, and the reason they did this was to get into the jewelry business. Because a lot of jewelers didn't want to go to the UK. There was a lot of restriction with gold in the UK right after the war. So Christie's opened that office. And then between 1950 and 1980, they started to open offices all over the world because they saw that there were a local need for the auction expertise that did not exist locally, especially in the US. New York had auction house, small ones that didn't have a global reach. So Christie's and Sotheby's bought those small American auction house and gave them the name and then established themselves in New York. The last one to do this was Bonhams, who bought Butterfield in Los Angeles about 15 years ago. And Butterfield was a big, big auction house in California. And Bonhams bought Butterfield and called it Bonhams. Butterfield doesn't exist anymore. Incidentally, Butterfield had just been bought by eBay, and eBay didn't know what to do with it. So between 1950 and 1980, you have those auction houses that start multiplying, buying offices, opening offices all over the world, and selling goods. But it was still dealers, it was still a small portion of the merchant business. And it's only after 1987, which was a very important year for the auction business, when in 1987, Van Gogh sunflowers was sold for about $80 million, where the press kind of talked about it, about this huge record for Van Gogh. And auction house realized that they had a way to talk to the public through records. So you take a specialist, you take an expert, you put it in front of an audience, and you say, hey, look, this guy knows everything about paintings. And it will go on, they will use this, and they still use this today with experts. They will put somebody in front of people and say, this guy is the expert in his field, and he will teach you all about whatever you're interested in, whether it's painting from Van Gogh or modern paintings like Picasso's or even watches. Now we're going to talk mostly about the watch guys and who are those watch players today. First, there's a category of international players, and these are people that have been well established in the watch auction world for the last 20 years. The auction business is really a 20, 25-year business for watchers. Before 1995, actually 1989, there was not much of a watch business for auction house. And 1989 is the year that Antiquorum, which is the first one here, a laser thing, I don't know if it's working well, but you can see it on the left, did a thematic auction on Patek. We're going to talk about it later on Patek Philippe in 1989 for the 150th anniversary of Patek. And that kind of established the auction business for watches. And Christie's, Sotheby's followed up about 5-6 years later by opening departments that were offshoot of the clock department. First, they were selling clocks, and then they went among the experts and they say, hey, among you, is one guy interested in watches? And one guy will lift his hand, okay, now you're the expert in watches, and we'll do watch auctions. So it's really a 20, 25-year-old business, so very, very young, and that's very important to keep in mind. The auction watch business is a very young business. So you have the four players. Philips obviously is a newer player. They came around 5 years ago when Aurel Bax left Christie's and went to work for Philips, actually went in a partnership with Philips. Those guys together represent about 250 million of the watch business. So it shows you that how small this is. If you go to your average modern painting auction, one auction is about a 1 billion auction. A whole year of those four guys, which is about 40 auction, is 250 million. So it's really tiny. But they're not the only one. Thing is not working. Sorry. Regional players. Smaller players that are locally pretty strong. So these are the guys, you may have one in Miami, I don't think so, but these are the guys that are well established in a certain city and do well in those cities. Bonhams has been doing very well in London, for example, but not doing well anywhere else. But in London, Bonhams is a name. Then you have Auctioneer Croat, which is based in Frankfurt, which is a very strong auction house in Germany, and they're kind of specialists in the pocket watches and the German watches. And Arcurial, which is a French one, who's famous for cars, but now it's kind of famous for watches, at least in France. And I call them the regional player because you won't see them so much in the rest of the world. You won't see those guys in Hong Kong. Well, bottoms you would, but not really for the rest of them. And last, you have another kind of players, which are the niche players. And when I say niche, is mostly they work on specific thematic type. Watches of Knightsbridge, they do a lot of military and vintage watches from the 50s. If you want to buy a Breitling, if you want to buy a Hoyer, Watches of Knightsbridge might be the guy to go to. Heritage in New York do a pretty good job with smaller items. Sotheby's, Christie's, Phillips are mostly selling you watches above $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. Those guys go more in the $2,000 to $5,000 category, which is important because when you start collecting and if you want to really start going to auction, I always tell people start with small items because you'll make mistakes and you'll learn from your mistakes. And we're going to go over that too. This is just to give you an introduction of what the auction and the players are. Fellows is not very famous, but they have a great platform on the internet, and it's a great way to bid on the internet. This is kind of give you an evolution of the watch auction market in the last 20 years. What you see in blue is antiquarian, and you can see the rise of antiquarian to 2002, and then the slow decline of the house of antiquarian. And then in pink, you can see the huge, between 2002 to 2016, you can see the huge rise of Christie's, and then they start to decline when Phillips shows up, the purple guys, in 2014. You can really see that it's separated with 4 players, and each of them goes in decline in certain ways. So the blue was the rise of antiquarian, the red was the rise of Christie's, and now you can see it's the beginning basically of Phillips as the main auctioneer. And what you can learn from this is that the expert is actually the driver for an auction house, because you can see that Christie's went a bit down when Auerbach's left to start Phillips and took some of the market share of Christie's. What's very interesting is if you look until 2000, how big antiquarian was. I mean, they control about 70% of the watch market, and then there's a slow decline after Patrizzi left. This is more concrete stuff for you guys, is how to sell a watch at auction. I know that a lot of people are always wondering, how do I sell a watch at auction? How do I go to an auction house, and what should I sell those guys if I have a watch for sale? So I give you some kind of feedback about what those people will tell you and what to do with it. First of all, an auction house always wants a fresh to market item. So fresh to market is auctioneer speak for something that was not sold already by a dealer or by another auction house. Fresh to market is if your grandpa passed away and has a 1518 that he wore his whole life, and he's giving it to you and you want to sell it, is nobody has seen that watch before, and people get really excited by this because obviously it's brand new to the market, nobody knows about it, and it will excite collectors. So that's the thing that watch auction house love. If you have a family heirloom and you want to sell it, an auction house will be happy to take it. Obviously, if your family heirloom is a Timex with Snoopy on it, it's a bit different than if it's a Patek Philippe Perpetual Calendar 1580. Then they show you something called the contract. And the contract is a piece of paper where they say, oh, well, you're selling with us, you have to pay us a commission as a seller commission, and you have to pay a fee for the pictures, and you have to pay us a fee for this and a fee for that. I can tell you this advice. Everything is negotiable, and auction houses are known to negotiate those things. So if you go to an auction house and you have something of value, and when I say something of value, if you're bringing a $3,000 watch, it won't be much of value. But if you're bringing something that's $50,000, $100,000, you definitely have something that gives you point to negotiate. Your commission, picture fees, things like this. The other one that is very important is the reserve. So what's a reserve? A reserve is a minimum amount that somebody should pay for that watch. And a reserve is basically where the auction house will sell your watch. So if you have a watch and you think that it's worth $50,000 and you will take no less than $50,000, that would be the reserve. The problem of the reserve is that it's linked to what's called an estimate. Legally, the estimation and the reserve cannot be completely different. So if you have something that is worth $50,000 and you put a reserve of $50,000, you have to put an estimate with a lower estimate at $50,000. That's a trick that you guys should know. When you read the catalog and you see the estimate, the lower estimate is usually the reserve, meaning the auction house will not sell at less than the lower estimate. Is that clear? Except, of course, if there's no reserve. And this usually is in big or in red. It will tell you we don't have a reserve. This is our estimate, but there's no reserve. Usually, auction house wants a low reserve because they want to sell your watch. The watch is already in the catalog, it's been photographed, they have talked about it, they tour with it, they want to sell that. To them, they have to sell it. And obviously, you as the person owning the watch, you want the maximum amount of money to be sold at. So there's a conflict here. I always tell people, I always give this advice. If you want to sell it, put a low reserve because it attracts people. Because the reserve is tied up to the estimate, if it's so low estimate, a lot of people will be attracted to that watch. They think you'd get a bargain. The more you have people attracted to something, the more you'll have bids. Reserve is just a number, and if it's too high, you will turn off everybody. Always put a reserve that you think is a little bit slight, less than the market, to attract biddings. High reserve will turn off people. Very low reserve is stupid. Put something a little bit below the market, something that you think is a bargain for you. And then you have a good reserve and a good estimate. And finally, again, you can always negotiate your commission and fees with the house, especially if you don't care and you say, hey, no reserve. In that case, you can really negotiate with the auction house. And the last and most important thing is getting paid. Auction house usually pays you 30 to 45 days after the auction. But if you read the tiny little contract, they will pay you only if they have been paid. Because the auctioneer is never the owner of the watch. He's just a middleman that will hammer it to the new buyer. You're always the owner of your watch until it's hammered down. That's why there's a hammer. The hammer is they pass ownership from you to the highest bidder. So as long as those guys have not been paid by the highest bidder, you guys, the seller, will not be paid. And that's very important to remember. But usually, auction houses do a decent job to try to get you your money because they get paid when you get paid, and it's 30 to 45 days. If you hear that an auction house doesn't pay on time, avoid. Now, how to buy? Buying is a little bit more, I always think that selling is easy, buying is much harder with auction houses. You have the catalog, which is basically the business cards of an auction house. Auction houses, the business cards is this. They will show it to you every 5 minutes. They will distribute it. They will give it away. There's a rule, never buy a catalog. Never, ever. If you buy a catalog, you're not doing it right. Catalogs are to take for free. You go to the auction house and you ask for a catalog, you should get a catalog for free. They should never buy. You should never pay for a catalog subscription. You look on the internet, you print it out, but never pay for a catalog. So we're going back to this auction in 1989, and I'm going to go through how the catalogs has evolved and how to read a catalog. So this is the Antiquam Hasburg-Feldman April 9, 1989 auction, and it's a really important auction historically. Incidentally, it's the first auction I ever attended in my life. It was at Hotel des Bergues at the Four Seasons in Geneva. And they made a catalog of only Patek Philippe. And if you look at the catalog, you see there's two watches on the picture, and very important watches. You have a 1518 and a 2497. And those watches have a pretty short description that you can see, and then you have a translation in Japanese, because at the time, Japanese were the biggest buyers. So every catalog was in Japanese. You never see a catalog in Japanese now. You see maybe Chinese, but you never see Japanese. And those two important watches are slapped in there, and there's a small description and nothing much going on. And they sold, I think they sold basically for about the low estimate for both watches. And that was the way they sold watches for a very long time. Small description, you don't know much about it. You have to go look at the watch to know what was going on. 10 years later, Antiquam did another thematic auction for Patek Philippe, and now you can see The evolution is a little bit better. They put a picture of an advertisement of the watch back in the 50s. You see the 1518 in two pictures. You see the back of the watch. You have a description. You can see at the bottom, right at the bottom, you can see those small things. That's called a footnote. That's very important. They start to tell you all about the 1518, why it was made, how many were made. And this is kind of an evolution that started in 1999. And again, Anticom was leading in this, where they put a little bit more and extra. But it was not still enough, and the internet kind of changed things when about 5 years later, you can see that this is taken from the internet. This is the Farouk 1518. That was a watch that was owned by the king of Egypt. And Anticom sold it. And you can see that this time they did even more. They show you the back case of the watch. They show you the movement. The description, the footnote, is huge at the bottom. You can really see that those guys are now writing a novel about the whole Egyptian king. And that watch sold, I think it was 2004, and it sold for about $250,000 with the bracelet. And now you go forward, 10 years later, the same watch sold by Christie's. You can see that they don't have the bracelet anymore, but it's the same watch. And you can see how much of a job Christie's did. 4 pages. Now it's not even, it's like a whole storyboard about that watch with a picture of the watch, what the French call a soldier of the watch on the top, which is a front picture. Then the whole history of Farouk with a picture of Farouk. Then the whole history of the provenance of the watch. Then a little picture of the extract of archives. Then another picture of the watch. Then what you see, you have a whole advertising of the watch, another description of the watch, and finally the watch with the logo of the king. So they spent 4 pages on this. By the way, a page is about $1,500 for an auction house. That costs them, each page costs them about $1,500. To photograph, to ship, to publish, it's a lot of money. So this is the watch that sold for $250 in 2004. Where in 2014, it sold for, any guess? $250 in 2004. How much did it sell in 2014? Nobody even venture a guess? 1 million? Another number? 425. See, not so much of a good investment. Swiss, by the way. We're looking a little bit more at that watch. I want to show you the footnote. You can see you have that picture is right at above the watch, that little yellow things, that's the extract of the archives from Patek. Patek, for 100 Swiss francs, gives you an extract of the archives. Anybody who has the serial number of the watch can get, and you can request that the auction house does it for you, and then you have a description of the watch. And the book, if you don't have that catalog, I'm sure you can find it on eBay, buy it. It's a 2014 catalog, it's leather bound, it's really a beautiful watch book. And I'm sure you can get it for $60. And then there's something that the auction house doesn't publish, but you can request. And that's a very important item. It's called the condition report. Condition report is the specialist, when he looks at the watch, he describes how the watch works. And this is not in the catalog. You won't find this in the catalog. The condition report tells you if there are scratches on the back case, if the movement is running, if it's keeping time, if the chronograph is working. They're supposed to do that. And you should always request a condition report before the auction. And every auction house will send you a condition report. Some of them, Sotheby's and Christie's, you just have to request it online, and I think you put your email address and they mail it to you. I think that's what they do, but you can easily get the condition report. Super important before you buy a watch, and I'll tell you why later. All right, so I'm going to show you now. I know it's a horse, it's not a watch. What you saw with the Farouk story is something that I want you to be aware. I could have done it with a watch. The problem, if I do it with a watch, all my friends in the auction business are never going to talk to me anymore. So, and there are plenty of examples of this, so I decided not to do it with a watch, but to do it with a horse. I'm going to show you how auction house take one watch and basically sell it 3 times in a row over maybe 10 years, and triple or quadruple or multiply the value of the watch by 10, and you still have the same watch. And I couldn't use a watch, but trust me, I had like 10 in my head when I was doing this, but I'm going to do it with a horse. So you get the idea. So here you have a horse, and that horse is 2 years old, and it looks like a nice horse, right? And that horse is sold at auction, and that's done every day at auction. And that horse has a description like a watch, color is bay, and you have a little description, it's tall, slim, athletic, it's a racing horse. And then you have measurements of the horse like a watch, and then you have an estimate, $60,000 to $100,000. And by the way, that horse really sold between $60,000 and $100,000. Somebody paid, I think, actually $150,000 for that horse and took it home. And what do you do with the horse? You ride it for races because this is a racing horse. And he did some races, and that horse won a couple of races, and then that horse won a lot of races. It's American Pharoah, he won everything. It's like one of the most important horses in the history of horse making, of horse races. And then I imagine that horse is being sold at auction. That's not true, it didn't happen, but what will happen if that horse is sold at auction? So what would an auction house do? Well, like a watch. They will tell you everything that the horse won. He won this and he won that. And then they will give you a description of the horse. It's a bay colt with a faint star and the same description, but it will tell you all about his racing career and who bought it and who his mother was. And that's basically what the auction house should do for that horse. And then they will put a huge estimate because this is like an important horse, 5 to 8 million, right? I mean, you can do a lot. You can make a lot of baby horse with that horse. That's the whole idea. And that's basically what auction houses do. When a watch becomes a star and becomes popular, they will take that watch and tell you all about it and make it more important, which is great. And I think everybody will agree with me that in terms of we are collectors, we want this. The problem with that is when it gets really over the top. And that's when they take the horse and they make it like a unicorn. That horse can do magical things. That horse can make your life better. It belongs to Elton John. And they have no reason, but they will make things up. They will tell you that horse, that watch, we think it belonged to this really famous singer. I was with this woman called Jen A, and he gave it to her, and she sold it. Like, you will hear a story like this. And this is really when the whole thing about watches becomes really bad, and where auction house kind of exaggerate things, is when the horse is the unique. By the way, there's a watch that was sold last year that was called the Unicorn. And basically you get the idea. But that's basically what happens. I mean, that horse can produce rainbow. I mean, you know, it's like this exaggeration about the watch, and it's the exact same watch that was before, a great watch, an amazing watch, but that's kind of too much, and that's kind of the point. But I can transpose this for a fee with a couple of watches that were sold in the last 2 years. And then you have social media that go in there. That horse is fantastic. That horse is badass. That you have all those things that social media and Instagram go about the horse. And they just reproduce whatever the auction house writes and says to have people get excited about the unicorn. When the unicorn at the end of the day is a little pony in front of, and you get pictures like this of the super rare watch in front of the Geneva, that's my daughter's, by the way. But you get this stuff, okay? So the idea here of the horse is to tell you, you should never, ever buy the hype, never. Like, block the hype. If you're buying something and you think it's being hyped, block it. Avoid it. You want to block the hype, you want to be a skeptic. Anything that an auction house tell you, or a dealer for that matter, be a skeptic. If they tell you, oh, somebody famous owned it, but we cannot tell you because we're an auction house, avoid. If they need to tell you that somebody famous owned that watch, it means that the watch itself doesn't stand on his own feet. If the person that sells the watch wants themselves to be known as a seller, it will be disclosed in the catalog. If an auction house says you are, but we cannot tell you, but avoid it. When an auction house tries to hype the watch for you, when an auction house tries to tell you too much about how great a watch is, there's something wrong with the watch. 2 years ago, an auction house wrote in the footnote that a watch was a great investment. I mean, you read this and you're like, in the US, you're not allowed to write this stuff legally without having the SEC on your ass. And when you see an auction house writing this stuff, you know that there's something wrong with the business. So really be a skeptic about this. When you read a catalog and a footnote, be a skeptic. Now, the most important thing, go view the watch. Like viewing the watch is, and if you cannot go, if you're in Miami, have a friend in New York that you think knows a little bit about watches to go have a look. If you cannot, email the expert, you have their name on the catalog, and ask them to make pictures of you. Live iPhone pictures will be better than a catalog pictures. Catalog pictures are not photoshopped, but what they do is they put, the photographer puts some kind of film on top of the picture to make it more smooth. There's only one person who hasn't done it, and it's my friend Michael Friedman here. We used to shoot raw pictures of watches. Am I right, Michael? And you got a lot of slack. People were not happy about this. Yeah. And he would take pictures of the watch, and it was not the best angle. And that's basically what you want. You want to see the watch without makeup. You wake up, you want to see that watch, no makeup, right out of the bathroom. That's the way you want to see that watch, okay? If you get the watch just because it's a pretty pictures on Instagram or on a catalog, you don't want to buy the watch, or you're not doing the right homework. So, and obviously you can call the expert and ask questions. Bother those guys. They hate it, but bother them. Basically do your homework. Buy this watch like you're buying a used car. You want to do your homework. And now what you have to do after you've done your homework is you have to come up with a maximum price. And you really should stick to that. I mean, obviously, part of your homework is you're going to see what the watch sold for before, what the dealers are asking for this. And you should go in that room and be disciplined and have a maximum price. I realize that because there's increment and there's auction, you may be right a little bit above. So try to have maybe a range, let's say 10, 12,000, but don't go above that range because you want to be able to bid in the increment that is offered to you. But never go above your increment. And always go to the auction house with a piece of paper, or I'm going to show you, there's an app for this, but always go where you know exactly what you will pay. So you can make a spreadsheet and you can add a 25% premium because you don't get to see the premium on the board, you see only the hammer price. And you have to add 25% and sometimes sales taxes to that. So you should have this prepared. You come with a piece of paper, don't be afraid, you have it in the catalog, and you know that if you bid 10,000, it will cost you 13,000. So right away you know what's going on, and you don't get surprised when you get an invoice. In short, be disciplined. Do your homework and be disciplined. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about doing the auction and the best way to do it. Register and come early. So register whether it's telephone, whether it's internet, whether it's live, register early. Why? Because you don't want to be rushed. You don't want to be rushed. You don't want to show up like 5 minutes before your item comes up if you come in the room. Because first of all, you want to have a feel of what's going on. You want to see who's bidding what. Are there a lot of dealers in the room? Are those guys buying a lot? Is it super exciting? In Hong Kong, it can be like lots of people and they're bidding left and right. In New York, it's getting there now, but 5 years ago, it was a bit more subdued. In Geneva, everybody knows everybody. It's a little bit more, like old friends bidding against each other. But you want to go early because you want to have that idea of what's going on, especially if you've never been there. You want to get familiar with the place before you bid. You may be nervous about it. You want to hang around a bit to calm down and be ready for your watch. Bidding. So there's 3 ways of bidding, 4 ways actually. Attending, phone, internet, and written bids. The best way is attending. You're there, you're in the room, you could have seen the watch before that, you can have a feel, you can cut a bid. You can say, there's a bid at 10,000. The next bid is at 12. You may say 11,000. Nothing prevents you from doing this. You have a feel. You're in the room. You can talk to the people in the room if they've seen the watch, what they think. If you hear your watch has not a good dial, you will hear it in the room. This is the kind of things you'll hear. The second best, in my opinion, is phone. Why? Because you're a specialist on the phone. It's recorded. Whatever she tells you is recorded. You can have this recorded. She can also give you ideas of who is in the room. Is there a lot of people? What's going on? You can ask questions to a human being. The third way is the internet, which I think is also a good way, nearly as good as phones. You get an idea of what's going on, but you don't have an idea of what's going on in the room. The worst, which I tell you never to do, never ever do written bids. Do not do a written, they love written bids. Written bids does not work, never. Why? Because you're sure, if your price is high, you're sure this is gonna be the price you're gonna pay. It's automatic, and the reason it's not that the auction house is cheating on you, it's just that the auctioneer presentation, and I've auctioned in a lot of auctions, is we have the auction book in front of us. I know I have $100,000, your bid. I'm going to push it. Why? Because it's good for me. The more I push it, so I will push it and push it and push it. I will stick you guys with it so it goes up to at least that number. So I know I did a good job. Because if I get you to a lower number, it means that I didn't do a good job to my boss. So rule is no written bids. Finally, etiquette. Don't badmouth watchers. You come in, be discreet. Don't be a big mouth. There's one rule I learned is there's always a bigger and better watch expert than you in the room. Always. You're never the big shit in the room. There's always a guy who knows more than you. And keep that in mind when you go in. There's always in an auction house. There's always a guy who knows more than you about any topic. So don't be a big mouth about this, and don't talk to the staff during the auction. That's a rule that a lot of people don't know, but auction staff, you can talk to them before the auction as much as you want, but during the auction, you're not really allowed to. The reason is they have all their clients' paperwork, they have all this stuff going on because this is the most important day of the year for them. They're in business 2 or 3 days a year when they sell at auction. So they have all their paperwork, all their notes, and having somebody show up and start asking them questions is no good. They have to hide the stuff, they have to be discreet about it. You ask your question before the auction, not during the auction. And what I mentioned earlier, prepare a bidding spreadsheet or use a little app that I use personally called Hammer and Premium. It's an iPhone, I don't know if Google has it, but it's a little app that any auction in the world that you are, you put I'm at Bottoms in Hong Kong, and it will do everything for you. It will tell you what the premium is, what the tax are, and you can use that as a guide to how to bid, how much you will pay. You guys are following me? Is it boring? You falling asleep? All right, what to do at post-auction. So let's assume you came in for a watch, you didn't get the watch. You didn't feel like it, it was intimidating, you didn't feel like bidding, who knows? Or nobody was bidding and you're like, oh, maybe something is wrong. I don't want to bid, I don't want to be alone by bidding. There's something called BIs. BIs is a term that auctioneers use. It's put in. It means that you can go to the auction house with a watch that hasn't been sold, and you can say, hey, I'm interested in buying that watch. Can you lower the reserve? Can you talk to the seller that he lowers the reserve for me? I want to pay X amount plus the premium. Don't forget, the premium they want the money. But you can lower the reserve. You can lower the price of the watch if the watch hasn't sold. If the watch has not sold, the auction house still wants to do business. So you can always go back to them. You can write them an email. You can call them up and say, hey, I'm interested. The earlier you do this after the auction, the better, because this is, after a few days, the watch goes back to the seller. As long as the auction house has the watch, you basically have a chance to do business with those guys. Paying or the art of settling your bills. I give always this advice to people is pay fast. And the reason is this. First of all, you pay fast, the auctioneer, the specialist, they remember you. They know that you're the guy who came, bother them all day before the auction, you bought your watch, but you paid on time. He can go back to his seller and say, hey, you got paid, everything is fine. They will treat you as a good customer. You have guys that they don't pay for months. And the auctioneers, they don't forget this. They're like, this is that asshole who hasn't paid his bills and I have to go back to my seller, and they don't want to deal with you. They'd rather sell to somebody else that's not going to make them a problem than to you. And if you're a good buyer, if you pay fast, they remember that you're the guy they want to sell you the watch, and they will always help you with that. Carrot Amtor, the art of dealing with issues. So if you remember, I told you there's a condition report. That's where it gets tricky. You're basically buying a watch that you're not really familiar with, and there's no warranty, unlike in a store. So what if there's a problem with the watch? Well, in 90% of the case, you're on your own. In 10% of the case, the auction house should help you. And the reason is they help you if in the description they wrote something, or in that condition report they wrote something that is not true. So if they say that the chronograph was working, but you get the watch and the chronograph is not working, they should fix that for you. If they tell you that the case is nearly perfect with light scratches, but you find a deep gouge, they can help you with this. But if the watch is not keeping good time, no. Sorry guys, you have to go to a watchmaker to do it. It's not a store, it's an auction house. So basically what you see is what you get. Except if there is something in the watch that is inherently described improperly. If they haven't talked about it, you're on your own. And if you read those descriptions and if you read the condition report, there's a whole lingo of low verbal that says, well, we're not saying that the watch is working properly, we're just giving you a description of what we see. So my rule of thumb when you buy a watch in an auction house is be prepared to do an overhaul. You be prepared to put the money for an overhaul, and you should budget that. That's the way I do it. Now I want to touch bases with a little bit what's going to happen, what I think is going to happen in the next few years. I think there's going to be kind of two different of auction. You're going to have the really expensive stuff, the $1 million watches, the $300,000 watches that would be sold at auction in live audience, and then you have the less expensive things, the $5,000 to $25,000 watch that would be sold at auction, but through different media like the internet. Christie's is doing it now. Sotheby's is doing it, and I think this is the way it will happen. The more affordable the watches, the more it will be on the internet and less in live auction, because those catalogs are expensive, because touring with those watches is expensive. Because if you give them a $10,000 watch, maximum they will make $2,500 with that watch, right? The 25% premium that they will ask. And $2,500 is not enough for them to break even. Between the catalog, between the insurance, between having the watch going on tour all over the world, it's very hard for an auction house to break even. So you're going to see those watches on the internet, and you're going to see the more expensive stuff, the 1518, those Paul Newmans, you will see them being sold in catalogs and tour around the world. The other thing that is important is 20 years ago, when you would go to an auction house, I mentioned the Patek auction house of 1989. When I went there, I must have been one of the youngest guys in the room, but there was only dealers. There was no collectors. It was dealers were buying at auction and collectors were buying from dealers. And auction house realized this, and now they're competing with dealers, and they want to have your business. So they want to be more of a retail operation than a wholesale operation. I mean, Paul came yesterday, and I'm sure did an amazing presentation. And to you guys, because he wants your business. That's what auction house want. They don't want to deal with dealers. Dealers means that they're not doing a great job for their sellers, for the consignors. So auction house go more and more in their retail business and less in the wholesale. And I think that's the future for them. Using technology to lower barrier of entry. We talked a bit about it with the internet, but also social media, where auction house are using more and more of these things in order for you guys to be able to see that those watches are coming. And obviously, sending you a catalog over the mail is very expensive. Having you look at the catalog downloaded from their website is much easier. And auction house have been doing this, especially watches. I mean, to his credit, Anticom and Osvaldo Patrizzi were doing auction online and doing catalogs online way before the big major guys. And more experts are becoming dealers. Those guys are more interested in cultivating new customers and collectors to sell them things and look for stuff for them than trying to just go to grandma funeral and tried to distribute some business cards to see if her husband had a watch. I'll give you a short example. I had, when I was an auctioneer, when I was doing some consulting work for auction house, and they sent me to Arizona, and an old lady was selling her husband car. And they gave her the catalog to show her what job they were doing, that auction house. And in the back of catalog, there was a picture of a watch, of a $24.99 Patek. And she looked at it and she says, oh, that's funny, I have that watch in my cupboard. This watch or something that looks like this? Like they thought maybe a universal journal. No, that watch. So she went and she retracted it. She had it in next to her bed, this watch, and it was a $24.99. Her husband had been a doctor. When he graduated from medical school, he had that watch. He had passed away in 1981. She left the watch on this side of the bed for 40 years. And she had his car for 40 years. When the car was worth $100,000, we sold the watch for $750,000. And it was great. That old lady called me and said, oh, you changed my life and the life of my grandkids who can now go to college because of a watch that was in the drawer. But this is very rare. Today, you get watches from collectors who have them, and experts go to those guys and are more and more like dealers who try to cultivate that thing. That's basically it, so thank you. If you have questions. I think there's a mic. I'm going to bring you a mic.
You talked about the BIs in the auction. How about percentage-wise? How many watches end up in that category not sold?
Well, it depends whom, but I would say on average it's 80% sold, so you have 20% of BIs. And then how much to ask? You cannot insult an expert, basically, that's the rule I have, but usually you can ask 10 to 20% below the low estimate, plus obviously the premium. But don't go and call the guy and say, I give you half of the estimate. Insulting the expert never works. Working with them does, but never insulting them. Oh my God, I have a feeling I'm not going to know how to answer that one.
No, stop it. I want you to talk about this one. There's a myth out there, you and I haven't even spoken about this for a long time, that all vintage watches are on the way up. This is projected in the media, from collectors, from auction houses themselves. Can you share with us, all of us, a few models that's not the case from important companies that maybe you're at 20-year lows and things?
Well, I did a talk last year. Anybody was at my talk last year? No, none of you. Yes, some of you. Remember I did watches investment? And I kind of said there's only one watch. Basically, there's only one watch that was a good investment at the end of the day, and it's the Paul Newman Daytona. 17% return over the last 30 years, annual. It beats everybody, stock market. Anything else is a dog. Anything else, and I mean every Patek, $24.99, 3970s, you name it, is a dog. Except, of course, if your name is Eric Clapton and you have that one-of-a-kind watch. Yeah, it's not a dog if you're Eric Clapton and you bought the watch for $200,000 and you sold it for $5 million. But is Eric Clapton in the room? No. And this was one-of-a-kind platinum watch. Watches are a terrible investment. It's a good life for your wife. It's a terrible investment. So if you go with this basis that there are terrible investments, but you look at pricing and you're like, oh my God, he's saying this, but prices are going up. Well, prices are going up. It doesn't mean that it's a good investment. A lot of price go up, and they're often a terrible investment. But to go back to that question, today there's a huge increase in vintage watches. I mean, there's stuff that 5 years ago you were buying for $2,000 or $3,000. There's $20,000, $30,000. Guys like me who have been around for so long and maybe sold those watches at $5,000 are saying, this is stupid. Yeah, I sold the watch at $5,000, now it's at 25. I look like an idiot. But the truth is this, is you always need to have a guy who's willing to pay more than you. And I'm having a very hard time when somebody pays $500,000 for Paul Newman Daytona to believe that in 5 years some guy is going to pay $1 million for it. Last year, for you guys that were here, I did a projection of where the Paul Newman Daytona needs to be in order to have the same increase of 17% return in 20 years. It was like 20 million. It was like every Paul Newman Daytona had to be $20 million, which we know is not possible. Trees don't grow to the sky, you know. So my opinion is there's a fade that is going on with a lot of the vintage watches, a lot of them. And I really think today bargains is the modern stuff. I think that it's the modern stuff. There's a lot of stuff out there. I had lunch with somebody who's doing watches today, and we were talking about a watch brand, and I told him how much they were selling the tourbillon on Chrono 24, and he was like, why is nobody buying this? And I am, he is too, but there's stuff out there that in the modern that is so cheap, and nobody is buying it, because people are chasing Universal Genève for 30 grand, and you're like, what? For the same price, you can buy gorgeous tourbillon. Speaking of Audemars Piguet, you can buy an Audemars Piguet today, an equation of time, Equation du temps. That was a $70,000 watch 20 years ago for 20 grand. Like new, box and papers. Sure, the design doesn't look great because you're in 2019 and you're not going to see it on Dinky. But will I buy one? Yes, tomorrow. Absolutely. Equation du time, perpetual calendar, it's a no-brainer. You have a lot of stuff like this, and people kind of forget that. And auction houses are not pushing it either, because it's easier to sell a Paul Newman that is all over the internet. Anything else? Thank you, guys. Oh, go ahead. Wait, they're bringing you a mic.
Thank you. So for the price point, let's say $20,000 and under, when is it better to bid at an auction versus call a deal? Like, when would one call a dealer and when would one auction? Is there a huge discrepancy between the auction prices and then just trying to find a good dealer and get the watch?
Less and less, because auctioneers go more and more with private clients. The pricing are basically getting together. And don't forget that also private dealers, the auction business is the Wall Street of private dealers. Private dealers have merchandise, and there's no way for them to price it. You cannot price to market your inventory as a vintage dealer. I mean, I know this is a bit banker talk, but pricing to market is, every day you look at your portfolio and it's priced to what Wall Street closed at that day. Well, for watches, it doesn't exist. You cannot look at your watch collection every day and you know exactly what's worth. So what you do when you're a dealer is you price to market compared to the auction business. So you look at your watches and you have an idea, because you attend those auctions, how much the watch is worth. And you're like, well, my watch sold at Christie's for $100,000. So I'm going to ask $100,000. The auction house drives the price for the, and this is also a topic that I didn't talk, is what is the funny stuff at auction? Is there funny stuff going on? Because you think that a bunch of dealers can really run up the auction. And this happening or not, you be the guest, but it has also to do with the auction businesses. You have a few watchers and you have a few dealers that control that market, and they can bid that watch up to the price they want. Which dealer today in the world wants Daytona's Paul Newmans to go down in price? None of them. They all have them in inventory. So if a few of them get together, they make sure that the price of that watch doesn't go below a certain price. It's a tiny amount of stuff. You can really easily corner the market on the vintage watches. So the price to pay is basically the price of the last. A lot of dealers will tell you, at the last auction, it sold at that price.
Thank you.
So what I do is I look at a watch and I will decide, is it worth it to wait for that auction, or should I buy it from that dealer? Yeah. Thank you, guys.